Welcome to Mr. Sandman, where tonight your worries can rest and the stresses of the day fade into the background. Whether you've had a long day or are just looking to escape for a while, let my voice be the guide to your peaceful slumber. Tonight, I have two stories for you, one that will send chills down your spine, and another that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So close your eyes, let go of today's troubles, and let me help you drift into a world of dreams where every sound carries you deeper into sleep. Relax, breathe, and let the stories unfold. Your peaceful rest begins now. The Mirror Game. The mirror stood silently in the center of the dimly lit room, its glass surface cold and unyielding. Four friends, Katie, Lucas, Jenna, and Tom, sat around it in a half circle, the room cloaked in silence so thick it felt suffocating. It was midnight on Halloween, and this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The Mirror Game, a dare they'd read about online, a forbidden ritual that promised unimaginable power to those who completed it. It was said to show you a glimpse of something beyond yourself, but only if you had the courage to stare deeply into your own reflection without blinking. The rules were simple. Each person was to sit in front of the mirror, one at a time, and repeat the name Raven's Cry 5 times without breaking eye contact. They'd dismiss the warnings, chalking them up to superstition and online exaggerations. Tom, the most daring of the group, volunteered to go first, sitting cross-legged directly in front of the mirror. The others held their breath as he locked his eyes with his own reflection and began to whisper, each repetition of Raven's cry getting softer, more hesitant. By the 5th time, his voice wavered, and he looked as though he might pull back. But he didn't. He held the gaze, staring into the dark, glossy surface of the mirror. For a moment the room was still. Too still. His friends leaned in, watching for the punchline, some laugh or flicker of fear in his eyes. But as they stared, the silence thickened into something darker, pressing against their skin. Then, Tom's face in the mirror started to change. The edges of his features seemed to blur, subtly at first, then with a sinister intensity. His eyes appeared hollowed, as if pulled deeper into his skull, the color draining out until they were pools of cold, lifeless gray. Jenna gasped, but Tom remained frozen, unable to look away. His face in the mirror stretched unnaturally, the mouth twisting into a ghoulish grin, so wide it seemed to crack his skin. His friends pulled back instinctively, terror blooming in their chests, but Tom sat rigid, paralyzed, his own reflection grinning back with a malevolent glint. Then he blinked. The reflection blinked too, a fraction of a second slower. The smile widened. "What the hell, Tom?" Katie whispered, her voice a quivering thread of sound. She reached out to touch him, but his skin was ice cold. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the mirror, even as his friends whispered and tugged on his shoulder. Finally he shuddered, breaking the trance, and looked up at them with glassy, distant eyes. "It's just a game, right?" he mumbled, his voice soft, distant. But Tom was changed after that. His friends tried to laugh it off, convincing themselves it was just a trick of their minds, but none of them could shake the image of that twisted grin in the mirror. One by one they took turns. Lucas was next, sitting reluctantly before the mirror as he repeated the name. As he finished the 5th recitation, the air in the room felt colder, sharp, and heavy with dread. His reflection rippled like a reflection in dark water, distorting and twisting. Lucas's mouth opened in a silent scream, though no sound escaped his lips. His reflection twisted grotesquely, eyes widening with terror, lips curling back to reveal sharp, crooked teeth. He broke contact, gasping, shaking violently as he pulled away from the mirror, leaving Katie and Jenna to stare in horror. Did you see it too?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. They nodded, but something compelled Jenna to move forward. Jenna's heart pounded as she took her place, knees weak, barely able to whisper the name 5 times. She squeezed her hands tight in her lap, her knuckles white, as she forced herself to stare. Her reflection stared back, an eerie, emotionless version of herself. Suddenly, her image in the mirror raised a hand, but Jenna hadn't moved. The hand in the reflection reached toward her, fingers stretching as if to press against the glass from the other side. "No, I, I can't," she whimpered, breaking her gaze, and immediately staggered back. The hand in the mirror froze, its palm still pressed against the glass, leaving a ghostly, fogged imprint on the mirror's surface. The three friends stared at the imprint, the outline of a hand too slender, too twisted to be any of theirs. The realization set in, a cold shiver running through each of them. Whatever was in the mirror was not them, it was something darker, something with its own will. Katie was the last to go. She knew they couldn't leave the game unfinished, not without risking the wrath of whatever they'd summoned. Her friends watched her sit down, her face pale, hands trembling as she gazed into her reflection. She forced herself to say the name 5 times, her voice breaking by the last repetition. This time, the mirror did not wait. Her reflection smiled, a twisted, knowing look, as if mocking her fear. Then it leaned forward, lips moving to form words she couldn't hear. Katie strained, trying to make out what her reflection was saying. The lips formed one word over and over. "Stay." Katie tried to look away, but she was frozen. Her own eyes in the mirror were no longer hers. They were deep, endless pits, empty and cold. Her reflection leaned closer until its face pressed against the glass, the skin cracking as it pushed harder and harder. Then, with a sudden sickening lurch, the reflection's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and a hand shot out from the mirror, clawed and skeletal. The hand gripped her wrist, ice cold, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. Her friend screamed, pulling her back. The hand's clawed nails leaving deep scratches in her arm before releasing her. She fell back into Lucas's arms, clutching her bleeding wrist, her eyes wide and filled with terror. The mirror rippled once more, and they could see their own reflections, pale and shaken. But then, in the reflection, they saw one more figure behind them, a figure draped in shadows, with empty, hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Without another word, they fled the room, slamming the door behind them. But as they left, each of them caught a final glimpse of the mirror. Their reflections remained staring back, but their faces were twisted, grotesque versions of themselves, each wearing that same horrific grin. That night, none of them could sleep. The nightmares were endless, filled with images of their twisted reflections, the cold grip of skeletal hands, and whispers that grew louder with each passing hour. As the days went on, they began to see flashes of their reflection in every mirror, each time more twisted, more malevolent. They would catch glimpses of their own eyes turning hollow, their smiles stretching into that eerie grin. And every time they tried to look away, they felt an icy grip, like the ghostly hand holding them in place. One by one, they each went missing, leaving behind shattered mirrors and clawed, bloody marks on the walls. The mirror sat, silent and waiting, in the empty room, its surface dark and still. And to this day, anyone who dares look into that mirror is said to see them, their twisted faces, still staring, still trapped, forever calling others to play the mirror game. Okay, now for our second chilling story, The Collector's Curse. The air in the old mansion was thick with dust, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for centuries. Each creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty halls, a reminder that nothing alive had set foot here for decades. Yet, it was not empty. The mansion was full of something much worse, the restless, hollow souls of those who had fallen victim to the collector. No one remembered how he came to be, the collector, but every local in the neighboring village knew the legend, a whispered tale passed from generation to generation. They said he was no ordinary man, but something far darker, something ancient. They said that he was a keeper of forgotten things, a curator of souls. But the worst part? The collector didn't just collect objects or artifacts, he collected people. Evelyn had heard the stories growing up, of course, but stories were just that, weren't they? She never believed them, not until she found the invitation. It was an antique yellowed parchment with elegant script that beckoned her to come. "We have something of yours," it read. "Come and take it back. The collector awaits you." Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped her, Evelyn couldn't resist. Her curiosity burned hotter than the fear. And so, against every instinct, she drove up to the mansion one cold, moonless night, the wheels of her car crunching on the gravel driveway as she approached the looming structure. As she stepped out of the car, a gust of wind swept through the trees, making the mansion groan like an old man waking from a long slumber. A sense of doom settled over her, but she pressed forward, her fingers trembling as they gripped the rusted door handle. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, and she entered the mansion. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of decay and stale air. The floors, covered in layers of dust, seemed to swallow her footsteps, muffling any sound. The walls, lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, seemed to watch her every move with empty eyes. And in the distance, from the deepest part of the mansion, she heard it, the sound of something moving, slowly, purposefully. The hallway stretched before her, its length infinite, like a dark tunnel that promised only horror. She followed the sound, her pulse quickening with each step, until she reached the door at the end. It was adorned with intricate carvings, symbols she didn't recognize, their edges worn from years of use, or perhaps something far worse. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room inside was cavernous, dimly lit by a few flickering candles. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they were filled with glass jars. Some were small, others massive, all containing strange, grotesque things. Shriveled hands, curled and rotting teeth, pale human eyes, floating in fluid. But it wasn't the jars that made Evelyn's blood run cold. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. The collector was tall, too tall, with skin stretched over bones like an ancient mummified corpse. His eyes were hollow sockets, black as pitch, and yet they seemed to burn with an unnatural fire. He wore an old, tattered suit, its fabric worn thin and stained with the passage of time. In his hands, he held a brass key, its teeth sharp and jagged, glinting in the low light. "You've come for it, haven't you?" His voice was deep, raspy, as though it had been used to speak the names of the dead for centuries. "You've come for what's yours." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you mean? What do you have of mine?" The collector smiled, and it was the most horrifying thing she had ever seen. His lips peeled back, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, and stained with something black and sticky. He stepped closer, the room growing colder with each movement. "Everything," he rasped, his breath cold as it hit her face. "I have everything of yours, every piece of you that you ever thought was lost, every shred of your soul. It belongs to me." Evelyn took a step back, her heart racing. The collector reached out, his fingers impossibly long, stretching with an unnatural bend, his knuckles cracking as he moved. Before she could react, his hand closed around her wrist, and the world seemed to shift. A sudden intense pain shot through her chest, like icy tendrils creeping through her veins. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as images flooded her mind. Visions of her past, of every regret, every forgotten fear, every painful memory. They all swirled around her, chaotic and consuming. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened and the pain deepened as though he were pulling something from her. Something vital. Something irreplaceable. You can't take it," she cried, her voice breaking. "Please stop." But the collector only smiled, his black eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "It's already mine, child. You gave it to me the moment you entered this place. You're here because you've already been marked." With a sickening twist, he yanked his hand back, and Evelyn felt a part of herself tear away, like a piece of flesh ripped from her soul. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. She staggered back, falling to her knees, as the room spun around her. "Now," the collector said, his voice dripping with malice, "you will never leave. Your soul is mine to collect. Forever." Evelyn looked up, her vision blurred with tears, and saw that the jars on the shelves were no longer empty. Inside them she saw reflections of herself, distorted, twisted versions of her, frozen in time. And in the reflection of the largest jar, she saw herself, her face twisted in agony, trapped for eternity, just like the others. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth moved, her lungs burned, but there was nothing left of her voice, nothing left of her. She was becoming one of them, one of the collector's trophies. Her body was fading, slipping away into the nothingness. The last thing she saw was the collector's smile, wide and terrible, as he added her to his collection. And then the mansion was silent once more. But if you were to visit that cursed mansion, if you were to step through its rotting door, you might find, among the twisted horrors, a jar with a face staring out, a face that looks just like yours. And if you look closely enough, you might see the faintest hint of a smile.